All right, Patrick Svitek is a fantastic political correspondent over at the Texas Tribune. He joins us here on the Can We Please Talk podcast. Patrick, Mike Leon, Nick Savary, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You know, Patrick, I've been reading a lot of your work over at the Texas Tribune. I'm super interested in the state. Our producer lives in Austin. My sister lives in Killeen. So I'm very warped, let's say, in the Texas politics and understanding a little bit of it. We've had other Texas correspondents coming on to talk about different issues that are happening down there. I feel like Texas is at the epicenter sometimes of some of this stuff. I want to get your takeaways real quick because we were just talking in the previous segment about the nationwide abortion ban that's being introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham out of South Carolina, and the conference he just had. Obviously, Texas has one of the strictest abortion laws, on the books. Idaho has seen a challenge as well from the White House because of federal funding, which protected doctors from performing abortions. What do you make of everything happening with respect to abortion and how it will be on the ballot? Potentially in your state, are you hearing that from voters in some of your reporting in terms of abortion access and this being a pressing issue to want to turn out to go to the ballots this November and vote for maybe Beto O'Rourke for governor?
Well, as you pointed out, or as you inferred, even before the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Texas was instituting some of the strictest abortion restrictions in the nation. There was a near total ban that the governor signed into law before that Supreme Court ruling, and the legislature had already passed what they call the trigger law, banning abortion in virtually all circumstances if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned. And so you have those two laws already in effect and leading to one of the most sweeping crackdown abortions in the country at the state level in Texas. As far as the politics are concerned, we have seen this issue kind of creep up the list of issues that voters consider their most important issue as it relates to the November election. There was actually just a poll that came out this morning, Wednesday morning, that showed that abortion has, risen to being, I think, the third or fourth most important issue that voters name as it relates to the November election in Texas. And so, it is clearly playing into the political landscape here. And it's something that Republicans, do not want to talk about because the polling is pretty bad for them on this. There's obviously a lot of different ways you can gauge public opinion on abortion, but just to sum it up, all the polling I see of Texas voters show that they disagree with the current legal landscape in Texas, but often by wide margins. And so, Republicans are trying to campaign on other issues, trying to change the topic from this. They would much rather talk about the economy, much rather talk about the border, because they know that it is a real tough issue for them right now politically.
Patrick, most recent polling shows that Governor Abbott's about 5 points ahead of Beto O'Rourke. That's currently, I think from actually Texas Tribune had reported that about 10 hours ago. With what we're seeing, I know recently you wrote a story involving looks about $6 million being sent to a campaign from Could Have Been Worse LLC, which is a great name for a company. What's going on with and the way it was talked about is like dark money, like money that's not accounted for. From your reporting, like what's being made of that between that polling data? Does Abbott's campaign continue to look as strong? Beto closing the gap? Like, what's your read of it as we're about to head into October?
Yeah, that group is really interesting because in about 8 years covering Texas politics, I've never seen that kind of advertising from that kind of entity in a statewide race on that scale. And so having a dark money group like that come into a statewide race is pretty, and spend that much money or reserve that much TV time is pretty unheard of in Texas politics. The ad that they're running, or at least that they're initially running, is really interesting because it really seems to get at the kind of dour mood that Texans are in right now. I mean, we started seeing in polling, several months ago that, in some polls for the first time in their history, more Texans were saying the state was on the wrong track than the right track, which is pretty unusual. Even if Texans disagree with the decisions by their elected leaders, they tend to think things are going okay in Texas, that the economy's humming along, that they're personally doing well. And so having the right track, wrong track upside down in Texas is a pretty unusual situation. And if you look at the advertising that this group is running, they're basically just rattling off all the kind of calamitous events that have happened in Texas in the past, mostly in the past 2 years under Governor Abbott, and laying them at his feet. So the advertising just talks about, for example, the school shootings that we've had. Most recently the Uvalde school shooting, talks about the power grid collapse in 2021. And then talks about some things that are a little more up for debate politically, like what they call stunts at the border. But clearly the advertising is trying to appeal to that voter who feels like the state is on the wrong track for the first time in a long time, and obviously connect that to the leadership of Greg Abbott. And so it's a very interesting effort because of, again, the fact that it is undisclosed money, at least so far, and that's unusual for a statewide race in Texas. And then also interesting just because of the messaging, which again seems to really try to appeal to those voters who, even Republicans, who feel like the state is just not on the right track after years of being on the right track.
Patrick, I'm so glad that you kind of made a segue there about, like some issues that are potentially publicity stunt wise. And I want to get into one here because a while back we had Lauren Villagrán on from the El Paso Times. And at the time, this is when Governor Abbott and now Governor Ducey as well from Arizona had started busing migrants over to D.C. And when we talked with her at the time, she mentioned, look, from a logistics standpoint, there are a lot of migrants that are sent to big transportation hubs, right? To be able to go to other places where their family lives or, relatives while they wait out their hearings. Now, the mainstream media, I hate using that term as somebody who's worked in the mainstream media. Now the mainstream media is picking up on this, and we're seeing a lot of stories being generated around these buses from Texas and Arizona coming to DC, and these different migrants being sent in different directions from that transportation hub. I want to get your take as somebody covering down there and everything that's happening with the border. Is this overblown nationally? Are we just overblowing this? Is this a publicity stunt? What's your read on it in terms of like what Governor Abbott has instituted policy-wise to send these migrants to DC?
Well, I think it's clearly a political stunt. I don't think Governor Abbott would use that term, but I think that he would concede that he's trying to make a political point here by offering these bus rides to these migrants to Democratic-held cities. So I don't think there's any real dispute over whether it's political or not. Again, maybe Governor Abbott wouldn't use that term, but I think he would say he's trying to make a point. And so I think Texans understand that there is a stunt aspect to this. But at the same time, it is true that these communities along the Texas-Mexico border have been, really stretched thin and overwhelmed by the amount of immigration, just migration that they've been dealing with, and that they have not had the, we've heard from elected officials in these border communities from both parties, who are, talking about how overwhelmed they have been. And I think even, there are certain elected officials who feel conflicted. They obviously, especially the Democrats, want to be welcoming of migrants who are, the overwhelming majority, we understand, to be coming to America to seek a better life. But at the same time, they have to govern these communities, and they have a limited budget, limited number of resources. And so Abbott is obviously trying to make the point that, these Democratic-led, much larger cities are not willing or interested or able to deal with a fraction of the kind of, migrant influx that some of these communities along the border are dealing with. So I guess to sum it up, I would say I think few people disagree that it's a political stunt, but I do think there is a legitimate issue that that political stunt is trying to get at.
Quick break here. We are presented as always by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you could see my screen here, Fresh Roasted Coffee since 2009. This Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com, or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'll read you something here, Nick. They roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here, fresh roasted coffee. I always record with it. Nick, why don't you tell the people, you're a coffee snob, why don't you tell the people why they should head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee?
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. You know, if you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show.
Patrick, when you mentioned before about calamitous, which is a good way, I think, to describe Governor Abbott's this tenure this time around. We had recently on Matthew Brown, the Washington Post, talking about Georgia. And what had been noticed recently was that polling data is telling us that at the state level, there's more support leaning toward Brian Kemp, but at the Senate level, Senator Warnock's starting to pull ahead, from Herschel Walker. In Texas, when we think about Uvalde, the most recently another shooting actually over the past weekend, the power grid, we're seeing just a series of things that have taken place in the state. Are all those being laid at the feet at the state level, only at Governor Abbott, or are at the federal level, Republicans also feeling some political blowback for those for what's been going on?
For those events that you talked about, the power grid issues, Uvalde, Abbott is the face of them, and that's actually why I think they are. In some cases, they are such tough issues for Abbott because he has to own them. He can't really, for example, when it comes to the power grid, most of Texas has operated off the national power grid. You can't blame Joe Biden or a Democratic Congress for what happened to the power grid in Texas in 2021. It is an issue that, unfortunately, in terms of politics, that Abbott, there's no scapegoat outside of Texas for that. And so that's why I think it's, the power grid in particular is a tough issue for him, is because it is at his feet. And then also the school shooting in Uvalde, I think is similar. It is hard to escape blame for that. I think Uvalde's a little different in that you do have the botched law enforcement response. And so Abbott is, able somewhat credibly to talk about that versus maybe, his own deficiencies in leadership. But those are two issues where Abbott is definitely the face of the tragedy in some ways. And when it comes to guns, just to go back to the polling, we consistently see that Texas voters do want stricter gun laws. And so, like abortion, that's another issue where he is, so far, based on all the polling I've seen, where he is on the wrong side of public opinion.
Patrick, I wanted to ask you, I heard this on another political podcast, where they were interviewing Beto, and they were asking him what's different this time around in the governor's run versus the Senate run. And one of the things that he talked about was some of the places that he's been traveling to within the state to actually meet with voters, right? Not only undecided independent ones, if there are ones in Texas, but those really true conservative ones that do want an emphasis on stricter gun control, gun reform in the state. What is some of your read on Beto's campaign? And do you see something different? I know we asked you already about how you see this maybe shaking out, but where do you see it netting out in November? Is Beto closing the gap, or is there real traction potentially for the first time to have a Democratic governor in a long time, or is this just smoke but no fire?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the flip side of my previous answer or previous answers, where I talked about how Abbott is on the wrong side of public opinion when it comes to guns and abortion, I should note, I guess, as far as the issues are concerned, O'Rourke's biggest challenge is that despite the fact that voters have become more focused on abortion and guns in Texas due to these recent events, we still see polling that shows that their higher concerns are the economy, the state economy, and the border / immigration. And polls consistently give Abbott an edge on those. And so it really is a battle on these issues between the two of them in terms of the issue salience and who has the advantage on those issues. And so that is, like Abbott has challenges on abortion and guns, O'Rourke definitely has challenges on the economy and the border, at least according to the polling. When it comes to what O'Rourke is doing different this time, I'd say the number one difference is he's actually offering a clear contrast with his opponent. I don't know how closely you followed his race against Ted Cruz in 2018, but he largely declined to criticize Cruz, largely declined to offer a contrast. He aired some attack ads at the end of the race, but I think most people agree it was too little, too late. And so what we've seen this time around from O'Rourke is he, came out of the gate offering very clear contrast with Abbott. And so to me, that's the biggest difference, is he's actually defining the choice for voters in a way that he did not do in 2018. As far as him going to rural communities, to me, that's not a huge difference. He did that in 2018. He's doing it again this time. To me, the big difference is he's better known in these rural communities, so he gets larger crowds. But there's also a flip side to that, in that he is, not a fresh entity to some of these places where there may have been undecided voters in the past, and that he's been the Republican boogeyman now in Texas for a solid 4 years. And so his image in some of these rural communities and just statewide is a little more stubborn. He's, a little better defined. And so I think there are pluses and minuses that go with that. I mean, running statewide in Texas, that is always, kind of the catch-22, is that you have to work really hard to become known statewide. But usually by the time you get to that point, your opposition has criticized you quite a bit. And so your image may be a little banged up. And I think that's where O'Rourke is at right now.
Patrick, last Democrat governor of Texas was Ann Richards, before losing to George W. Bush. From what, in your assessment of Beto and Texas Democrats in general, what do they need to be able to do to bring forth that type of energy, from a previous Democrat governor? Because historically, you would think Texas, and you wouldn't think that it wasn't that removed that there was a governor who was a Democrat in Texas. But in comparison, as you just mentioned, the comparison between Beto 2018 versus this candidate version now, what hope does he have to reach out to voters beyond the major cities, obviously, of Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and the like, but in order to be able to bring together more folks as the Democratic Party goes, what would be your sense as far as like the shifts that Democrats have to make? Last question as for candidates go. How did you explain Ted Cruz's presence in that party, and not party within the state? I fluster at this because Ted Cruz is a cartoon character, and we've seen this throughout just his actions with the power grid going down and, becoming Fled Cruz, obviously. Does Ted Cruz go the way of where Texas is going, or does Texas represent a shift more toward being purple as opposed to a MAGA Republican like Ted Cruz being a representative of the state.
Yeah, Cruz is an interesting figure in Texas politics. The polling shows us that he's never been as disliked as the national narrative would suggest. I mean, even when he was in the fight of his life against Beto O'Rourke in 2018, polling showed that he still had a split favorability rating sometimes. And so I would say that the polling shows that Texas voters at least have always liked Ted Cruz a little more than what the national conversation may let on. Why, we could probably have a whole other podcast on. And so, but I would just say that, his reputation in Texas is a little better and more liked than probably the national narrative lets on. But it is true that, the Democratic baseline of performance in statewide elections in Texas is increasing. I mean, Joe Biden lost Texas by 6 points or a little over 5. I think it was a little under 6 in 2020. If the polling is right, Abbott may only win this November election by mid-single digits. And so the baseline for Democratic performance in Texas is creeping up. And Ted Cruz, could be on the ballot or is set to be on the ballot again in 2024. And if he does run for re-election in Texas in 2024 on the current trajectory, I think it's going to be a really, really competitive race, regardless who runs against him. I think the fundamentals in Texas are changing to the point that by the time Cruz is on the ballot again in 24, even if it's not a strong candidate like Beto O'Rourke, he's still going to have to work really hard for it. And so that's how I kind of think about Cruz's, political trajectory in Texas. As you pointed out, he's obviously embraced the MAGA wing of the party, was one of the, most visible pro-Trump senators on January 6th, for example, leading the charge, trying to overturn the election in the Senate. So, those are all things he's going to have to reckon with. And I think if he runs for re-election in 24, it's like I said, it's going to be a competitive race, even if he doesn't draw a strong Democratic talent like Beto O'Rourke.
Patrick, before we let you go, I'd be remiss. I mentioned it in the opening segment about the Texas Tribune having their 12th annual Texas Tribune Festival in Austin. Speaking of Senator Ted Cruz, he's scheduled to be there. There's a lot of prominent speakers added: former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Anthony Fauci, Representative Liz Cheney, Pete Buttigieg. A lot of discussion about different issues that are not only on the ballot, maybe not in the state, but across national issues like women and reproductive rights, COVID-19, legislation on infrastructure. Can you take our audience a little bit about, tell us a little bit about the Texas Tribune Festival and what you expect next week in Austin?
Yeah, this is the 12th annual Texas Tribune Festival, or Trip Fest as we know it, happening the September 22nd through 24th in Austin. We're back holding it in person after the pandemic, so we're really excited about that. Got hundreds of speakers, literally hundreds of speakers. And my favorite part of it as a political reporter is the speaking lineup spans the political spectrum. As you pointed out, Hillary Clinton's going to be there. Ted Cruz is going to be there. We obviously have more nonpartisan, policy experts and people involved in government. As you pointed out, Anthony Fauci is probably a high-profile example of that. But it is a great opportunity to get out, hear diverse perspectives, and hear elected officials challenged. Ted Cruz has been at the Trip Fest before, and he always has he always gets tough questions from the audience, and engages with the audience, engages with the interviewers. And so it's a great opportunity to see people from across the political spectrum face some tough questions, which is always important in democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the lineup is something I would love for a CWPT festival one day, Nick. We got to think about it. Eric Adams, Governor Newsom out of California, Glenn Youngkin, obviously from Virginia.
Eric Adams, but all right, man.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. We'll skim some of those folks out. Maybe Ted Cruz won't be a part of it, but Patrick, he's a fantastic reporter over at the Texas Tribune. Check out all the work that he does over on their site. Can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast today, Patrick. Continued success to you, sir, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.